from Monterrey, Mexico.
And Chris, I was just on a phone call with a speaking coach who is a friend of yours.
Michael B. We're not going to massacre his last name by attempting. We're just going to call him Michael B.
And he recommended lots of ways that I could be a better podcast host. But one of them is to start with a pilot of what people can expect from this episode. So maybe
that's probably a good point.
Yeah. So, I don't know what's. Do you know what the topic is?
I do, because I actually was on a plane, so I was looking at email, and it's a question of predicting consumer behavior and whether it's easier to do this when it's something you know yourself. And so what I would say is we talk about a couple different segments. We'll have an initial segment about predicting consumer behavior, and then we'll have another segment about what it means to design a product for yourself versus designing a product for someone else. And maybe we'll conclude with some closing thoughts on why consumer behavior is so hard.
So, okay, cool. So that's our pilot. I'll try to do a better pilot next time. But one of the things I realized speaking to Michael is that all the things, like he was telling me things I was doing well.
Mm-hmm.
I think mostly to be nice and not like lead with a bunch of negativity. But all of the things that I did well were all things I picked up from you.
Well,
am I back? Was I frozen?
He froze. Like this.
All of the things that I did a good job of, according to Michael, are things that I picked up from you.
Good.
And
this
like
is a good
I noticed
indication.
you were doing them, and I made a conscious effort to start doing them. And apparently those are the only good things I do. So there we go.
Well, again, the key is nobody has to be a natural at everything. You've just got to be able to learn from the experience, which apparently you have. So you've really demonstrated the most important skill.
Okay. So, Chris, I have in the past been a B2B founder.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously, consumer is different from B2B. So I'm kind of going into this a little bit more blind than I would otherwise. And it'd be helpful to me and presumably to the audience as well if you could, outline what is unique about consumer. And like, I think what it is that it's the consumers are kind of like fickle, hard to predict, etc. But can you give us more? Fickle's a bit is too negative.
Well, no. So let's talk about the decision-making process for consumer versus the decision-making process for B2B. And again, it's not that they're just two polar opposites, but there are significant differences in things like the level of formality to the decision-making process. So you're very used to the B2B decision-making process. And in the B2B decision-making process, what happens is the business decides that they need a particular product. They go out and they look at a couple of different possibilities. They talk with the salespeople, maybe test them out. And then they make a deliberate choice as to which one to pick. And then they purchase that item. So it's a fairly formal process. The consumer is just wandering along, sees an advertisement, sees a link, clicks through, thinks, that looks interesting, whips out their credit card and pays, or puts in their email address and signs up. So it's a much less intensive decision-making process. Now, there's pluses and minuses to that. The plus is that consumer behavior can change quickly. Consumers can make decisions a lot faster than businesses can. The minus is that if you're very used to the B2B sale, where you're really focused on being able to provide a ROI case for why you're going to buy something, that really doesn't apply in the consumer world. The great example of this is my friend Ramit Sethi's podcast, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. He has couples on all the time. And what's amazing is the level of decision making that the average consumer puts into the most important purchases in their life is almost zero. So the two most important purchases that people make are their house and their automobile. Those are the two most expensive things that most people pay for in their lives. And most of the time, they do so without even remotely realizing what's the nature of the transaction is. As Ramit would put it, they always just ask, what's the payment per month? Never realizing that that is just a tiny component of the overall total cost of ownership, or TCO, which every business understands instinctively. And then they buy a house that's too big for them, or they buy a car that's too big for them, or they buy a boat or some other moronic thing like that. So consumers are more impulsive, more emotional, and it's because they do not have as dedicated and rigorous a decision-making process. That being said, it's not like consumers are totally different from businesses or vice versa. Businesses have individual human beings who are users, who have emotions, who like certain that there's always a human being in the decision-making process. The questions is, are you frozen again? Because you were frozen for a while, and maybe you didn't hear me. Was I frozen?
No, I heard most of what you said. My
Okay.
internet, I think, is sucking today. It actually gave out earlier for some reason, but I don't know. At
Nothing
least
we
I
can do
look
about that.
fancy.
Yeah, nothing we can do about it. We just got to proceed and perhaps work on it in editing.
Well, okay, so I think part of the equation that I've been thinking about is, so when I think of myself as a consumer,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's this restaurant down the street from me,
Mm-hmm.
and it sells some type of pork. Okay. And I really like that type of pork. And there's another restaurant up the street from me that sells the exact same type of pork.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the one down the street just opened this week. And I've never been to the one up the street. But I've been going every day to the one down the street. They're the exact same distance. And it's really, there's a kind of this like psychological cost to going in the direction of the street that I never go.
Right.
I never go there. Therefore, if I go there, it's this whole new thing, and I just don't have the energy for it somehow. So there, but and that's somehow irrational, or feels irrational when you say it, but it's actually pretty, like, if you think about it, it actually is rational. Like, there are other things in my life that I should be spending my emotional energy on than getting pork, right? And so maybe there's an irrational element. Like, I don't know. It's kind of like a beginning of a thought, but what
Yeah.
can you rip
So
off that?
of course. So what you're experiencing is what we call the finite amount of executive function available in the day. So executive function is basically your brain's ability to make decisions and use willpower. And there's only so much of it because it's based on the amount of glucose you have in your brain. And once you use it up, that's it. You are low on executive function. And so it is true that if you are just blindly walking down the street to this restaurant and getting the pork and you like the pork, that may be fine, because it's probably not worth it for you to do an intensive study each time you go out the door. Should I go left? Should I go right? What are the pluses? What are the minuses? It's not worth it. However, what it does also indicate is that human beings are creatures of habit. And it is very easy for consumers to make decisions based on habit and reinforcement that may be suboptimal. They are easily lured into a local maxima instead of pursuing the global maxima.
Okay, so if I am a startup founder and I am building a business that sells to large enterprises, and this is something we discussed, I think, 2 weeks ago in our last episode that people can go and listen to. Part of, like when you're talking about enterprises, they really think about things in terms of ROI, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can, like in my last business, something you and I worked on, Chris, we'd make the case that this was like people could get leads and they could get more sales, and these are the cheapest leads, and that was the ROI calculation that worked.
Right.
When you're dealing with consumers, they're not thinking in terms of ROI, and they're thinking in terms of a bunch of other things. And maybe the right way of thinking of consumer decision making is it's a system that is so complex. So it's not irrational, but rather it's so complex that we can't understand it rationally or something like that.
So, of course, there's the famous Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman, who is well known for a variety of things. And he, of course, wrote the very famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think there's a useful distinction there. He describes system one and system two thinking. And we have one type of thinking, which is impulsive, instinctive, and the other, which is slow, deliberative. And the business to business decision making process is typically slow and deliberative. It's that system two kind of thinking. Whereas the consumer decision is system one thinking. When you and your friends are thinking about, hey, where do we want to go to eat for dinner? You do not say, oh, hold on, let me get a matrix out. Let's take down a list of criteria that we need to look at. And then let's look at the different potential restaurants. Everyone's going to need to put a numerical score in. We'll do an average score. I'll double weight mine because my judgment is better. And then we'll have an answer. No, you say, what do you feel like doing? I don't know. How about that place? I didn't like that. How about this place? All right, that's all right. Let's go there.
But if I am, like, as an entrepreneur, right? It feels to me like I understand that there are factors, and I can understand those factors, but it's too hard to predict those factors. So, for example, to me, right, Uber Eats.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why people use Uber Eats. Right?
Or DoorDash.
Yeah, like if I was to rationalize, like, let's say it did not exist, my rational kind of belief would be, hey, the one thing that everybody wants to save money on is food. That's the one thing that everyone is most cheap about all the time. They'll spend money on a lot of things, but food, they never want to spend any money. Don't tell me you're going to give them charge them a 25% surplus for convenience when they can just get food in some other way. In my rational brain, and that makes no sense. Yet, people are addicted to Uber Eats and DoorDash. So I'm clearly wrong.
Well, you're clearly wrong in many ways, because if you start thinking about it, people spend way too much money on food. Way too much. People eat out far too often. People do all sorts of wildly irrational things. Now, to you, the airport. Get to the airport, and we get through security, and it's probably around 4:40 a.m. And what Jeff said is, oh, I'm going to go get some juice, and I'm going to go get some coffee from Starbucks. I'm like, do what you want to do. The lounge opens in 20 minutes. They'll have juice and coffee there. And Jeff went and got juice and got coffee, and I, of course, did not. Even though I could charge that to my fund, it would be an expense that I would not pay directly, but I do indirectly pay, because that's profit. That's something that whittles away from profit, and I ultimately get a small piece of it. But it just irks me to waste money, even if it's someone else's money. But that is not the way the average American thinks. The average American thinks, I want a coffee.
Well, so what I'm trying to get at, and maybe I'm wrong, right? But what I'm trying to get at is that there are too many factors, and therefore you cannot actually predict what consumers are going to do. But it sounds like what you're saying is actually you can somewhat predict it, it's not going to be an ROI calculation like with businesses. And
Correct.
actually, like you and I, Chris, might not be the typical consumer, so we may, be thinking about things differently. Which might be why things seem to make no sense. But actually, there are certain factors, and it's kind of like ease of use, stuff like that
Right.
are not,
Force of
not
habit.
ROI.
Also, like for example, this morning, I knew with close to 100% certainty that while I would point out the fact that we would be going into a place that would provide us with all the coffee and juice we wanted for free in 20 minutes, that Jeff would still go ahead and get juice and coffee because I've observed his behavior in the past. I know how people think, especially when it's early in the morning. They haven't had enough sleep. They don't have the ability to exercise their willpower the same way. They just think, oh, that coffee tastes so good. That juice would really hit the spot. Whereas I'm like, I don't care, but I'm not a typical consumer. And you are definitely not a typical consumer either. So here's the thing, right? This gets to the second part of the question, which is, hey, is it easier for me to predict consumer behavior if I make a product for myself? And the answer is, it's easier for you to predict the behavior of consumers who are like you. And if there aren't a lot of consumers who are like you, that is a bad approach to take, right? If the consumers you are trying to appeal to do not think like you, don't base it on your own instincts. Base it on what you observe.
So, okay, so then the kind of stereotypical example of
Mm-hmm.
not understanding consumer behavior is Airbnb, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is like nobody in Silicon Valley thought Airbnb made any sense. Yet it's arguably, the only Y Combinator company that's actually been like massively successful. I guess Stripe as well.
Yes,
But
right, definitely.
but it's like a huge success.
Right.
It's exponentially more successful, for investors than
Yes.
Uber, let's say.
Yes. Very
Like
true.
it's one of like you could argue that at least in the consumer sector since Facebook, it's the most successful startup.
Yeah, it depends on what you count TikTok as, but
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
So let me address that because you said nobody in Silicon Valley thought it would work, which is not true.
But yeah, that's it. Some people did. Like the founders of Airbnb clearly did.
Is that the wealthy investor class of Silicon Valley generally did not believe in the idea. And a stranger's home to save money. And if you're rich, you're not willing to say, I'm willing to let strangers stay in my home for money. Both of those are just insane to you. Paul Graham famously said, what's wrong with your customers? Why would anyone do that? Because Paul Graham had already been rich for a decade at that point. And rich people forget what it's like to be poor.
Okay. So it sounds like consumer behavior is predictable.
Yes. It is
It's just
predictable to a certain extent,
yeah.
right? It is consumer behavior is almost always explainable.
Yeah,
Predicting it
of
is
course.
more difficult, but the more you understand the consumer behavior, the more likely you are to be able to make an accurate prediction. But where people go wrong is far too often they base it on their own instincts, which may not line up with the consumer base that they're actually going for.
So as a founder, I mean, I'm just clearly not the typical consumer.
Yes.
And so that's the case for me. I don't want to make, a call for you, but I assume you'd believe
Well,
that
I'm not
about
a typical
yourself.
consumer either. I'm a very atypical consumer.
And would you say that most successful startup founders are also consumer startup founders are also not typical consumers? Like, is that
They are somewhat atypical. However, the younger they are, the more likely they are to be closer to typical. And if they have not yet become enormously wealthy, they're also more likely to become closer to typical. And this
right?
is why we'll see a founder who, when they're young, has a great instinct about what to build. And then when they're rich, suddenly thinks, I'm going to do Uber for helicopters, which, by the
Right.
way, is a decent but niche business, right? This is the thing. I believe there's one called Blade
Hmm.
that's actually been reasonably successful. I don't know. I haven't taken it, because I'm not a rich guy who pays for helicopter rides.
Yeah, I know. Yes. Okay. So if you are essentially, if you're a student,
Mm-hmm.
there's a higher likelihood that you can actually predict consumer behavior
Correct.
and that your instincts will tell you something of use.
It is more likely that your instincts will tell you something of use for the young people's market or the consumer market. It's not going to help you for understanding how law firms are going to buy things. But for the people who are like you, and because when you're young, you're a lot like you're like a lot more people. That is an easier time to deploy that strategy. But that doesn't mean it's the right strategy to use. It just happens to be under those particular circumstances, you get it right. It's like a stopped clock being right twice a day.
Does that mean that that young people should start consumer businesses and older people shouldn't? Or does it mean that you should employ a different strategy than trusting your instincts?
So if I'll list out the strategy you should use. Not all people are capable of this strategy, and if you're incapable of this strategy, old people's audience, right? If you're a senior citizen, you've got a product that you're going to sell. So what you should actually do is you should develop your skills of observation, essentially anthropology. And to do this, you're going to have to get over some of your instincts. Because as you watch consumer behavior, you'll be tempted to say, that's the dumbest thing I've seen. Why the hell are people doing this? It just hurts my brain to even witness this. These are things that you'll be thinking to yourself. And you've got to suspend the disbelief, suspend the judgment, and say, okay, admittedly, I find this abhorrent, repugnant, insane, but there must be a reason they're doing this. Can I uncover that reason? And if you can uncover that reason, then you have more of a basis for making predictions. And it won't be guaranteed, but it'll improve.
And then you leverage these kind of like frameworks or insight that you got through a kind of like anthropological approach to then run experiments and learn more or something like that.
Correct. So, I mean, let's take an example of Airbnb. So, rich guy investor is like, that's crazy. Who would do it? I would say, it's interesting that you're getting people to do it. Tell me more about their demographics. What kind of people are they? What are their professions? Let me talk to some of them. Find out what they were thinking. Why did or that he was cool. And so I figured I would like him. I mean, these are all sorts of things that you could find out by just observing and talking to people. But it requires you to go beyond your gut instinct.
There's another kind of case here, which is Slack, which is not a consumer company, right?
Yes.
But the same things apply to me. So let's say Airbnb. I have no idea what anybody would say in an Airbnb or rent their home in an Airbnb. I would never do it. I think it's just the stupidest thing. Just like I have no idea anyone would use Slack. I hate Slack. I hate everything about Slack. And I don't know. I cannot imagine a scenario where anyone would ever use it. Yet these are really, really popular products.
Right.
So I guess what I'm like, am I right to believe that it's the same dynamic kind of at play? And then am I right to kind of conclude from that that there's like when you get into this kind of consumerization of the enterprise type businesses, the same approach applies or is relevant?
Some of the approach applies, right? Because again, in the consumerization of enterprise, it's still the case that the decision-making process is going to be more formal. So with Slack, they get around it by making it easy for groups to adopt Slack, but eventually people need to actually do a purchase contract and it becomes a part of the normal decision-making process. And with Slack, why is it that Slack works? Well, I will offer a couple of suggestions. One is that people were tired of using email, even though email is the thing that will never die. And I still use email more than anything else. But a lot of people were like, I don't like email as much. It's why they use text messages so much as well. The second, and this is more important, is from a consumer behavior standpoint, an instant message is more gratifying from a dopamine perspective. And you see that this is true based on the way people design things like WhatsApp and Messenger and iMessage and so on and so forth. Right? It's designed to say, oh, so-and-so is typing, right? They're giving you the feedback even before the message is complete. They're doing everything to get that dopamine going. And that's why it becomes so popular, because people are using it. They're getting these dopamine hits. It may or may not actually be making them more productive. But if they think it's making them more productive and they're doing that because they want to justify using something that gives them dopamine hits, you can still make a lot of money that way.
It sounds like what I should be doing, and other founders should do this, but I'm going to apply it to my personal situation. It'd be different for others, but for me, the thing I should be doing is saying, hey, I have no idea why anyone would use Slack. Instead of being like, what the hell's wrong with people, my reaction to that should be, what the hell do I not understand about people?
Yes. And again, there's a delicate balance here, because at the end of the day, if you discover that the dynamic that you uncover is one that you think is unhealthy or you just can't bring yourself to be a part of, you shouldn't do it. There's an interesting example of this. The founders of the company that became Juul,
yeah,
the vaping
yeah,
company,
the smoking thing, yeah.
They didn't set out to addict kids. They were smokers, and they were like, there's got to be something healthier. They're actually members of the Stanford product design department. They were smoking outside in the rain. Like, we got to come up with a better thing. And they developed Juul as a way of doing something that they hoped would be less harmful than cigarettes, less harmful, less addictive. But the problem is, once you discover this dynamic, you're like, wow, we can add these extra flavors. It really improves the user experience, makes it more addictive, makes it more appealing to kids. It's difficult to go back once you see that money rolling in. I don't think that they set out to create a product that was going to addict a new generation of kids, but that's what they ended up doing. And so you have to play out the end game, understand what the implications are before you go down that path. Because once you get started, as Yoda said, once you start going down the dark side, forever it will haunt your days.
So it's kind of like, you want to understand the behavior, but it's not because a behavior exists, and it's not because you understand the behavior that's behavior you want to necessarily encourage.
Correct. You can understand the behavior and then decide whether or not you want to be a party to encouraging it. And of course, sometimes people will say to themselves, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will. All right. Okay. If that's the way you want to do it, if that's what you want to live with yourself, is somebody has to pull the switch on the electric chair. It might as well be me. I mean, if that's the way you want to go about life, that's your prerogative.
So here's what I think is actionable for me and actionable for other founders. What I think is actionable is, whether you're building things for consumers or not, but especially like the more consumerish the things you're building are, whether you are like the typical consumer or not, but especially if you are not like the less like the typical consumer you are, you should be going about life noticing things that make no sense and then investigating those things. So for example, I'm in a co-working space. I might meet somebody at the co-working space and say, hey, do you use Slack? And they'll say, yeah, I use Slack. I'll say, what do you think of Slack? And I'll have a conversation with them about Slack. And I can kind of like learn about these things. I should just be curious about these things I don't understand about the world. And
But I also want to emphasize most people are not very reflective, and the answers they give may not be accurate. The best thing is direct observation. So you might say to this person who's a big Slack user, hey, how about when you're about to use Slack for a bit, call me over. I'd love to see how you use it.
okay, I see what you mean. So I would need to do that. So to investigate these things I don't understand, but I would need to investigate them in a competent manner. The way that I was describing is not that.
Correct. Just asking people is not going to give you the best answers. There is usefulness. Asking people is better than doing nothing. But most people are not self-aware enough
Right.
to answer accurately about themselves. They don't really understand themselves.
So what I should be doing is noticing things that make no sense to me, and especially if they're like frustratingly stupid. Like that's actually that's a sign of tremendous potential insight.
Yes.
Then I should be investigating those things, and the way I should investigate those things should be competent.
Correct. It's a matter of observation, pulling your own values, your own beliefs out of it, and observing as objectively as you can and coming up with plausible explanations why. And it's an entire way of looking at the world. I can tell you, and I don't say this very often, especially not in public, but as I go through the world and I'm watching people's behavior around me, I can often predict what they can do. And by the way, I know all sorts of ways I could then manipulate them and get them to do things. And I generally choose not to because I'm not a bad person, but I know that it's possible to do it. So that's why it's so important to exercise that responsibility. I would be a great cult leader or evil genius. But I don't believe it's moral for me to do that.
Okay, here's a question. When did you start adopting this approach?
It really didn't happen until I was probably into my 30s. And it took a while. So when you're young, you tend to view the world strongly through your own lenses, and it's difficult for you to see the world through someone else's eyes. And it's after you've lived a while and you've seen how you yourself change over time that you then develop the additional capability to sort of look at things more empathetically. And this is true, even though I spent a lot of time doing things with empathy, doing things like peer counseling when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. And I think doing a very good job of better than average of understanding people's behavior. But it took getting older and really being able to let go of my own prejudices, being a little less certain about the fact that I knew everything, including about myself, to allow me to then begin to adopt this mindset.
So, okay, I totally get what you're saying about it becoming easier as you get older, and like I've noticed this about myself. Like I'm in my mid-30s now, and I never believed that I was self-centered when I was younger, but I definitely was. Like,
oh yes,
I am so much more in tune with other people. It's insane how much I like how in tuned I am with others in a way that like compared to 10 years ago, it's like totally different.
And in another 10 years, it might even be more different, right? You don't
I
know.
assume, yeah. And okay, so I buy that. I also know many other people, Chris, who are my age or your age or even older, who don't do this.
That's right.
So what is it about when you were younger that kind of like got you onto this path of being able to do that in your 30s?
I think it's because I had a lot of curiosity about human psychology. And I would read various books about psychology, generally more popular books, specifically about the field of positive psychology and happiness. But when you start studying human behavior, for the purposes of understanding happiness, you understand a lot of other human behavior as well. And what I learned from some of these important books along the way is that we human beings are very bad at knowing ourselves. So a great example, Daniel Gilbert wrote a famous book called Stumbling on Happiness. And one of the core ideas to come out of Stumbling on Happiness is the power of surrogacy, which is to say, if you're wondering how you'll feel about something, the best way to figure that out is go find someone who's been through that and see how they felt about it, because we're not as special as we think we are. Right? So all of these books that I read, these different techniques, these different things I read about, revealed to me that, hey, we human beings are not these all-powerful, self-governing ids or super egos. Instead, we're a collection of various drives, some of which we don't even realize are occurring, which react predictably to certain stimuli and interventions. Okay, well, if that's the case, then let's try to understand human beings for what they are, not what we want them to be, not what would be simple, but rather what they actually are. And once you get around to accepting that people are not as you want them to be, but that if you understand where they are, you can improve your chances of moving them in the right direction, then you can begin to adopt this kind of mindset.
It sounds like regardless what age you are, you should be noticing other people, thinking about other people, thinking about how they are, how you are, and how you can influence them. And you should just start down that path as early as you can in your life, so that one day you can reach Chris' level of insight.
But hopefully develop morality along the way, because again, having this level of insight and then being willing to use it in ways that are detrimental to the people that you're actually intervening with is a bad thing and will eventually rebound on you.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Like, what being like?
So
Yeah.
let's just take the example. This is a person who does not manipulate people because he deeply understands them. He manipulates them based on just gut instinct. But somebody like Donald Trump had the ability to manipulate the feelings of others. And he did so because he's a great showman. He sort of instinctively knew what buttons to push versus having been able to understand why those buttons would work. Right? For me, when people say, I don't understand the appeal of Trump, I'm like, I hate him. I hope he dies. But I understand the appeal because the people that he appeals to feel like you think you're better than them. And deep down, you believe you are better than them. And hey, you know what? I probably agree with you, but that doesn't mean that they're going to like it. And here comes this guy who says, yeah, those assholes who hate you, who look down at you with contempt? Well, they look down on me with contempt as well. But unlike you, I can fight back and make them hurt. How does that sound?
And what you're saying is that the step, too far for Trump, or the thing that he's doing that's wrong, is that he's then using this power,
in ways that don't help the people that he is manipulating.
It's a little bit like what jumps into my mind when I hear you say this is, I think this might be from your book. It's definitely something that I heard Reid say about investing in vices.
Yes.
And something about how, you have to invest in. Yeah, it's from one of your podcast
It's
episodes.
from one of our podcast episodes. And what Reid says is that if you want to build a great consumer product, it needs to tap into at least one of the 7 deadly sins and preferably several of them.
But it's like a fine line to walk, because you don't want it to become kind of like antisocial, crazy stuff. So, and I think he had some examples about, on LinkedIn, people are just like adding thousands of people for no reason, just because they were vain and wanted to have a bunch of people they're connecting with. It's just like
there was a number associated with their name and they wanted that number to be bigger. And again, the key is that I think Reid is also a very insightful kind of guy and also could use his powers for evil, but chooses not to. Whereas there are other folks who shall remain nameless who go ahead and say, yeah, that sounds good. Let me use my powers for evil. Awesome.
So to give people a preview of what their life might be like if they apply this. So I think one, and we're kind of like wrapping this up. So I want to, use this as a summary.
Mm-hmm.
So what you need to do is to start noticing other people, start being curious about other people, and start investigating what is going on in the world around you. This will give you tremendous insight into consumer behavior and enable you to potentially start a really amazing next business. But it'll also just make you a better human and just like better at almost everything that you do. And that's kind of like the future you can expect for yourself if you start applying this amazing wisdom from Chris.
I'm going to take that and draw out some of the nuances, but I generally agree. So the nuance is that you don't have to agree with something in order to understand it. A lot of times, and you see this, right? You see this reaction on the part of some of these crazy religious fundamentalist reactionaries who will just say, I don't want to bother to understand that because that's just evil. And I'm like, you know what? That's not effective, right? That's not effective at all, because if you really want to change people's behavior, you would seek to understand it. So you have to draw a distinction between understanding and approving of something. You can understand things that you dislike or disapprove of, but it's still valuable to understand them, just like it's valuable for me to understand a bit more about how Donald Trump does things, for example. But then the other portion of it is not that it guarantees that you will be a better person if you understand folks. If you do understand people, however, you will tend to have more empathy. If you have that sort of empathy in you, then you will generally be a better person. But somebody who is a psychopath, who does not care about others, they just become a cult leader, because understanding other people does not create in them the empathy that causes them to say, and therefore I should want these people to be better off. Instead, it's like, fresh pawns for my game.
Chris, this was so insightful, and thank you for making this happen right on the end of your Monterey trip. So welcome back, and thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Julien. And don't forget, everyone, you should remember that if you want early access to the topics, that you should go ahead and join the Patreon, which is, Julien?
Patreon.com/blitzscaling.
Very good. Always got to hit those reads. Always got to hit those reads.